Amid the blazing skies over North Vietnam, one name became the first milestone in America's unfolding tragedy: the tragic fate of Lieutenant Alvarez. During the fierce bombings over northern Vietnam, perhaps the most tragic fate belonged to Lieutenant Alvarez, the first American pilot shot down and captured in the North. Amid the smoke and fire of war, when air raid sirens screamed endlessly across the skies of northern Vietnam, Lieutenant Alvarez, a young pilot of the United States Air Force, became the first American to be shot down and captured on enemy soil. He was only 26 at the time, a typical young American, neatly cut brown hair, bright eyes filled with unwavering belief in his mission. He flew the F-105 with practiced skill and a heart still burning with purpose. That fateful flight over Hanoi didn't just strip him of his freedom, it tore his personal life off course. Alvarez was captured after parachuting into an abandoned field on the outskirts of the city. Locked in a dim, narrow cell where dampness crept into his bones and peeling brick walls echoed the silence, he began what he would later call a life outside of time. 6 months earlier, far away in Florida, Alvarez had stood at the altar with a radiant smile on his face. His young bride, with golden hair, blue eyes, and a laugh as light as morning sun, was his college sweetheart, the love of his life. They had promised to wait, to weather any storm. But war doesn't just take lives, it shreds promises. One autumn day in the prison camp, as a thin beam of light struggled through the iron bars, the guard handed him a crumpled envelope containing a small, dirty piece of paper. A letter from home, and with it came a blow sharper than any interrogation. His wife had filed for divorce. No farewell, no waiting. She had left their little house in Gainesville and begun a new life, one without him. Alvarez bowed his head. In the nights that followed, no torture was as cruel as the whispers of memory echoing through his mind. He didn't cry. A soldier does not permit himself that. But deep within those gray eyes, the weight of loss gnawed at him day by day. For Alvarez, captivity wasn't just about being held in chains. It was being forgotten, not by his country, but by the one he loved most. Arrogance and the shock from Vietnam's skies. When the U.S. Air Force began bombing North Vietnam in 1965, they did so with near absolute confidence. Washington believed it would be a swift, overwhelming campaign, a walk in the park for elite squadrons flying state-of-the-art F-105s and F-4 Phantoms, soaring over Hanoi's skies as if there were no threats below. Inside the Pentagon, American military planners sat around maps of Vietnam, drawing neat circles labeled guaranteed safe zones. They believed their opponents were nothing more than peasant soldiers, many of whom had never even touched a radio, let alone operate sophisticated missile systems. Even though the Soviet Union had started providing air defense weapons in early 1965, U.S. experts insisted it would take at least a year before the Vietnamese could use them effectively. They were wrong, painfully wrong. Within just 3 months, a dense web of anti-aircraft fire began to spread across North Vietnam's skies. Camouflaged flak cannons, SAM battalions operating at stunning speed, and watchful eyes tracking jet contrails with iron focus, all of it came alive in record time. From July to the end of 1965, missions once assumed to be routine flyovers turned into harrowing encounters with death. American planes began to fall, first one, then entire formations. In 1965 and 1966, the skies over Hanoi became a killing field. U.S. pilots began repeating a chilling saying, "Flying over the North is like playing the lottery. Keep playing long enough, and eventually you'll win the hard way."
Hoa Lo, where dreams came crashing down.
By the end of 1965, according to official U.S. records, 61 American pilots had been captured alive. In 1966, the numbers surged. On average, 8 aircraft were shot down every 10 days. Most of the surviving pilots were sent to a place they would later call, by a grim nickname, the Hanoi Hilton, officially known as Hoa Lo Prison. There, the once proud officers who had ruled the skies now crouched in damp, narrow cells, stripped of their ranks and routines, facing endless days without calendars, without familiar faces, only time and shadows for company. They told each other half-true, half-humorous stories, mocking their own fate as a way to hold on to fragments of sanity. To the Americans, Hoa Lo was not just a prison. It was a living monument to a fatal miscalculation, underestimating a people who, in just 3 months, not only learned to fire missiles, but also learned to bring down America's most powerful illusions. Richard P. Kieran, the man who flew straight into prison twice. Some pilots are born to fly, but Richard P. Kieran seemed destined to crash land into captivity, not once, but twice. The first time was in 1944. A young airman during World War II, Kieran took off on what would be his first and only bombing mission over Nazi Germany. His B-17 was hit by anti-aircraft fire and went down. He parachuted into enemy territory and was captured the moment he hit the ground. For nearly 9 months, he survived as a prisoner of war in a German camp, learning in silence how long a single day can truly be. 2 decades later, another war, another sky. In 1965, now a seasoned officer flying an F-4C Phantom over North Vietnam, Kieran was once again in the cockpit, older, wiser, and perhaps just a little less naive. But destiny doesn't care for experience. On July 24th, his aircraft was struck by a surface-to-air missile, one of the first SAMs ever used in the Vietnam War. He ejected and was captured again. This time, he would remain a prisoner in Hoa Lo prison for nearly 8 years. Some called him the unluckiest pilot in American history, but to those who survived with him, Richard Kieran was a symbol of quiet resilience, a man who'd had his wings torn away twice and still never gave up. He outlasted 2 wars, 2 prison camps, and 2 decades of loss. Because some men aren't remembered for the missions they completed. They're remembered for what they endured without breaking. James Robinson Reisner, the broken-winged legend. If Richard Kieran was destiny's cruel joke, then the story of Colonel James Robinson Reisner was a solemn elegy for a hero whose wings were shattered and whose glory faded into silence. Reisner was no ordinary pilot. During the Korean War, he became a living legend, a name that struck fear in the enemy and stirred pride back home. With 8 confirmed MiG-15 kills, over 100 combat missions and thousands of flight hours in the most brutal conditions, he was the very embodiment of the American ace. He was the hero in the headlines, the man who flew higher, fought harder, and led better than most. But when Vietnam came, fate stopped smiling. In September 1965, during a Rolling Thunder mission, Reisner led a squadron of F-105s into North Vietnamese airspace. On his 5th mission, His plane was hit by enemy fire during withdrawal. There was no ocean beneath him this time, no helicopters waiting, no cameras to welcome him home. Risner was captured and taken to Hoa Lo prison, a crumbling French colonial jail repurposed into a dungeon of shadows. He remained there for 7.5 years. There were no more headlines, no parades. The man once graced by glory now sat in silence, forgotten by the world beyond the walls. But inside Hoa Lo, Risner wasn't just a prisoner. He was a flame. When men broke under torture, he tapped messages in Morse. "You are not alone." When someone refused to eat, he gave them strength with nothing but a look. When everyone was on the edge of collapse, he was the first to stand, chained, bruised, but unbending. Risner was a legend with broken wings, but not even the captors who bound him could break his spirit. The pressure to rescue, a storm from all sides. As the number of American pilots captured in North Vietnam kept rising, many of them sons of senators, military elites, or Wall Street figures, the pressure on the U.S. government mounted like a tidal wave. Generals were grilled behind closed doors at the Pentagon. Politicians were hammered in front of the press. But the greatest pressure came from quiet places, from wives, from mothers, and from handwritten letters landing on the president's desk. "My son is in Hanoi. What are you doing to bring him home?" War was no longer just about front lines. It had invaded American living rooms. At the Paris peace talks, the Vietnamese knew their advantage. Every captured pilot was a bargaining chip, and the U.S., they understood there were only two options: stay silent and lose public confidence, or act boldly. That meant planning a mission unlike anything done before, a lightning-fast raid deep inside enemy territory. Reconnaissance had already pinpointed the prison. Blurry satellite photos revealed fences, guard towers, even patrol paths. But the hardest part was still ahead: choosing the men who would walk into hell and come back. Selection in the shadows, the men without names. The selection process was cloaked in total secrecy. No bulletins, no official orders, just discreet nighttime phone calls and a single question: "Are you willing to volunteer for a special mission?" Those who said yes were placed on a preliminary list. Immediately, commanders began filtering them out. Newly married? Cut. Wife pregnant? Cut. Emotional attachments were liabilities. They didn't need soft hearts, they needed steel and silence. Then came the strangest round of interviews in military history. Do you know how to ski? How long could you walk through a desert without water? Does your skin burn easily in the sun? Could you handle being locked in a room with a group of Lebanese men who eat raw garlic but are terrified of water and refuse to bathe? No one understood, and that was the point. Commanders knew the soldiers would talk amongst themselves, trying to piece together the clues. They even gave the operation a code name: Russian Beach. Most assumed it was something in the Middle East or maybe Africa. No one suspected Vietnam. In reality, only 3 men knew the full truth: President Richard Nixon, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and a handful of trusted cabinet members. Not a single American general in Saigon was briefed. Even President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam was kept completely in the dark. A small group of men was being shaped in silence, trained in shadows, preparing to strike the very heart of the enemy, a place the world believed was untouchable. Brutal training, the furnace that forged sky warriors. To become an American airman, especially a combat pilot or a C-130 mission commander, required more than talent. It demanded survival through a gauntlet so grueling that only the rarest few made it through. The process began with weeks of psychological screening, isolation drills, disorientation chambers, simulated crashes. Those who passed were fed directly into the machine, a training program that crushed muscle, broke sleep, and rewired fear into instinct. Helicopter pilots had to fly at treetop level, threading through narrow mountain passes with no lights, no radar contact, no maps, all under the cover of night. A single miscalculated turn could send the aircraft and everyone on board straight into the rock face. For C-130 pilots, the ones who would lead the infiltration, the challenge was even more unforgiving. To fly low and slow, all 4 engines had to remain perfectly synchronized to fractions of a second. One slip, and the aircraft would shudder, dip, and fall. At such low altitudes, no one had time to deploy a parachute. No errors allowed, no muscle fatigue, no second guesses. Every nerve had to serve the mission. Precision on the ground, where one misstep meant death. If in the air they were birds of steel, then on the ground they became human instruments of calculation. Every man in the Special Operations Unit was trained to move in total darkness, with no compass, no tracks left behind. One footstep too wide, one heartbeat too late, and they risked stepping into a bullet meant for the enemy, but fired by a teammate. During drills, wooden cutouts symbolizing Vietnamese prison guards had to be shredded with bullet holes after every exercise. Any operative who missed 3 consecutive times was immediately cut from the team. No second chances. Because in a real firefight, a missed shot didn't just mean failure, it meant everyone died. Beyond shooting and stealth, they were trained to pick locks, cut chains, and carry hostages. A wounded colonel, a downed pilot with a shattered leg, a captured diplomat. No scenario was too far-fetched. Every possibility had to be prepared for. There were no easy drills, no wasted seconds, because once they stepped out of that aircraft into the night, every movement had to be pure math. No emotion, no error, no luck. Preparing for the worst, when plans had to outrun madness. The Americans weren't just planning for a successful rescue. They were preparing for the worst-case scenario, and they prepared it down to the smallest, most haunting details. No one knew exactly what had become of the pilots imprisoned for years inside Hoa Lo. No sunlight, no sound, no familiar human touch. After 5, even 10 years, what would be left of a man's mind? The planners posed a grim question. What if the prisoners had gone insane? So the special forces trained to carry a man in panic, not a fellow soldier, but someone thrashing, screaming, biting, striking out in total confusion. They learned how to lock wrists, immobilize shoulders, and speak in calm, steady whispers, even while gunfire roared around them. A special doctor was embedded in the team. He didn't carry a weapon, but rather a collection of seemingly odd items: warm wool blankets, soft rubber slippers, mild sedatives, and most importantly, specialized earplugs. Because they knew the sound of a helicopter engine, a roar of freedom to most, could shatter the eardrums of men who had lived in silence for years. Every scenario was run over and over, planning for failure at every turn. Because when you dive into the heart of enemy territory, everything that can go wrong. The golden window, when every second was a life or death equation. It's one thing to plan an attack, it's another to know exactly when to strike. And that answer lay hidden between weather patterns, political deadlines, and public pressure. After combing through 20 years of meteorological data, U.S. analysts discovered that in all of 1970, only one window had the right conditions: November 20 to 25, a narrow stretch of time with just the right balance of cloud cover, humidity, wind speed, and night visibility for a low-altitude, silent insertion. If they missed it, the next chance wouldn't come until March. But that was not an option. The American media was boiling. Families of POWs were marching in the streets. The Paris peace talks were hanging by a thread. Waiting wasn't just risky, it was political suicide. A rescue delayed too long would become a rescue abandoned. November 20th was chosen, not just because the skies were clear, but because it was the only moment in the entire war when weather, psychology, strategy, and public outcry all aligned. To support the mission, the U.S. Navy would stage a massive diversionary strike on Haiphong, drawing away radars, air defenses, and enemy attention. Meanwhile, deep inland, the real objective was underway: a surgical strike on a single point only a handful of men had ever seen on a map: Sun Tay prison camp. There would be no second chance, because in war, waiting one more day can mean burying one more hope. The last-minute shock, and the question that changed everything. Everything was ready. The engines were fueled, the men were armed, coordinates confirmed, final orders issued. For months, they had trained in the shadows, each movement rehearsed to the rhythm of a stopwatch, each bullet accounted for in the silence of mock battles. The clock was ticking toward history. Then, at 4:30 p.m., November 19th, just hours before launch, a message came in, a cold, flat intelligence update. No emotion, just data. All prisoners have been moved. Sun Tay is empty. The prison, the target they had built their entire mission around, was now nothing more than an empty shell of concrete and shadows. What do you do when everything you've prepared for suddenly becomes meaningless? Do you call off the mission? Do you go anyway, knowing there's no one to rescue? Do you risk American lives for an objective that no longer exists? And most of all, how did this happen? Who moved the prisoners? When? Why? And if the Americans didn't know, was the enemy watching them all along? These questions would haunt everyone in that room. But in the end, the decision had to be made. Fast, final, no turning back. What did they choose? How did the raid unfold? And what happened when the helicopters reached that dark patch of jungle near San Tay? All of that will be revealed in the next chapter.